Sir, step over here a moment.
I'm just heading to my car.
You match a report. Let me see some ID.
These are my federal credentials.
That looks printed at home. Try again.
I teach at the Bureau. I just finished a class inside.
Funny, they don't usually let people like you run training.
The moment in the parking lot didn't come out of nowhere. It grew from a routine day at a regional training center where federal and local officers often crossed paths. Nothing about the environment was unusual. An office-style building, a row of marked cars, a small lot where people came and went throughout the afternoon. It was the kind of place where familiarity should have prevented confusion. But that familiarity, as it turned out, wasn't shared equally. Earlier that day, the instructor, who had spent the morning teaching a communication and tactics seminar, wrapped up his class late. The schedule had run over, as it often did when groups had questions. He lingered afterward to answer a few last-minute concerns from attendees who wanted clarification on procedures. It wasn't dramatic or rushed, just an ordinary end-of-day wrap-up from someone used to being approached for guidance. Outside, a local patrol officer was responding to a vague call from a nearby business, a report of a suspicious male moving between vehicles. The details were thin. The caller hadn't stayed on the line or provided a description beyond a general outline. Calls like that weren't unusual. Most ended up being nothing: someone looking for their car, someone waiting for a ride, someone stretching their legs. But because the training center sat next to a small commercial strip, officers were occasionally asked to check on things that didn't quite add up. The officer scanned the lot, already pre-framing what he expected to see. His shift had been busy, filled with small disputes and paperwork delays. That kind of mental clutter made it easy to jump to conclusions. And when he noticed a man moving slowly between cars while reaching into his jacket, that conclusion seemed to solidify quickly. What he didn't realize was that the man he saw was simply digging for his keys while shifting a folder to his other hand. The gesture was ordinary, but through the lens of stress and expectation, it looked like hesitation or concealment. And in law enforcement, hesitation can be interpreted as suspicious. The misunderstanding escalated quietly at first. A call-out from across the lot, a request for the man to stop, a moment of confusion as the instructor turned, unsure why he was being addressed. The officer didn't recognize him. He had not attended the training that day. To him, the presence of someone near the federal vehicles without a clearly identifiable uniform fit the vague call too neatly. What made the situation more complicated was something that isn't always obvious in the moment: the subtle weight of prior assumptions. In many workplaces, people form quick judgments about who looks like they belong in certain roles. Those judgments aren't always rooted in malice. Often, they come from habit or limited experience, yet they still shape outcomes. In this case, the officer's assumption wasn't loud or aggressive. It was quiet, almost routine, but it carried the same potential for harm. When the instructor calmly presented his credentials, the officer didn't see confirmation. He saw contradiction, something that didn't match the picture he had already formed. And once a misunderstanding gains momentum, it can take far more effort to slow it down. The narrator's role here is simple: to lay out what happened without exaggeration. A workplace parking lot, a tired federal instructor, a stressed local officer responding to a vague call. These are ordinary ingredients that, put together at the wrong moment, created a conflict neither man expected. But this wasn't the first time assumptions had created friction in that environment. The truth was that small misjudgments had surfaced before, quietly, informally, rarely addressed. They didn't escalate to this level, yet they formed a pattern the agency hadn't fully recognized. This time, however, the consequences wouldn't remain quiet. Long before he became an FBI instructor, he was known for being the calmest person in any room. Colleagues often said he had a steady way of listening, never rushing, never assuming he understood before hearing someone out. That quality made him a natural fit for training roles, where patience mattered just as much as technical skill. He had spent more than a decade teaching communication tactics, scenario-based reasoning, and conflict de-escalation to new agents and visiting officers. Many of his students later said his classes were the ones they carried with them into real-world situations. His daily life wasn't extraordinary. He lived in a quiet neighborhood, coached his niece's basketball team on weekends, and had a habit of prepping lunches for the entire week every Sunday evening. He liked routine, he liked predictability, and he liked knowing he could rely on his own sense of discipline, something that had gotten him through long shifts and demanding field assignments earlier in his career. Over time, he transitioned from field work to teaching, not because he wanted something easier, but because he saw how many problems in law enforcement could be avoided through better communication. He believed deeply that most conflicts grew from moments when people stopped listening or jumped to conclusions. It was his mission to show others how awareness and clarity could prevent unnecessary escalation. He earned respect slowly and consistently. Supervisors trusted him to lead high-stakes training sessions. Visiting officers from local departments routinely sought him out for follow-up questions. He became known for his ability to explain procedures in plain language without condescension. It wasn't unusual for him to stay after class just to make sure no one left confused about a technique or policy. Despite all of this, there were subtle reminders throughout his career that not everyone expected someone who looked like him to hold his position. None were dramatic. A security guard once stopped him at the entrance to a federal building, asking twice if he was sure he belonged before verifying his badge. A trainee once assumed he was maintenance staff when he walked into a room early to prepare. These moments were small, the kind many people would brush aside, and he didn't dwell on them. But they left quiet impressions, soft echoes of how assumptions can follow a person from place to place. He rarely talked about those experiences. He preferred to focus on the work, on helping others understand how quickly perception could shape an encounter. He taught officers to slow down before reacting, to take in the full context, and to acknowledge their own biases even when they didn't feel significant. His approach wasn't accusatory, it was practical. He believed awareness could save careers, relationships, and even lives. Off the clock, he was the person friends called when they needed a steady voice. He volunteered with a local leadership program, helping young people understand how public service worked behind the scenes. He enjoyed long runs early in the morning, partly to clear his head, partly to maintain the habits he'd built over years of training. Nothing in his background hinted at confrontation. He didn't go looking for trouble, and he certainly didn't expect it in a parking lot outside the very building where he spent each week teaching others how to avoid unnecessary conflict. He trusted that professionalism would be recognized wherever he went. After all, he had built his career on helping others see people as they really were, not as they were assumed to be. And on the day of the incident, he carried that same calm confidence with him as he left the classroom, unaware that a simple walk to his car would challenge everything he taught. The day had been long, but nothing out of the ordinary. After finishing his class, the instructor gathered a few leftover papers, tucked them into a folder, and slipped it under his arm. The training room lights were already dimmed, and most participants had filtered out. He locked the door behind him, feeling the familiar transition from work mode to end-of-day fatigue. His plan was simple: get to his car, drive home, heat leftovers, and get some rest before prepping the next session. Outside, the parking lot carried the usual late afternoon rhythm. Cars passing on the main road created a low, steady hum. A delivery truck idled by the curb, its driver sorting packages. Someone across the lot finished a phone call before getting into their vehicle. These everyday sounds formed the background of a normal workplace environment, nothing tense, nothing unusual. He walked with his keys in hand, shifting the folder against his side. Earlier, he had promised to review a participant's written scenario notes, so he pulled the folder slightly closer, thinking he'd look it over that evening. As he moved between two parked vehicles, he reached into his jacket pocket for his car fob. The motion was casual, the kind most people perform without thinking. At the same time, the responding officer pulled into the lot, scanning the area based on the vague call he had received. Suspicious mail near vehicles wasn't much to go on, but it was the kind of report that could mean anything, from someone lost to someone attempting break-ins. The officer wasn't expecting danger, but he was alert in the way police often are when details are missing and they're left to interpret what they see. The officer noticed the instructor walking slowly, folder tucked at his side, reaching into his jacket. It wasn't an alarming gesture, but from a distance, in the gaps between parked cars, it registered as uncertain, a hesitation, a motion the officer felt obligated to double-check. The officer stepped out of his patrol car and called out, "Sir, hold up a second." The instructor turned, surprised but not alarmed. He wasn't expecting interaction with anyone, especially not an officer, but he stopped immediately. His keys were still partly in his pocket, and he kept his hand still so the movement wouldn't be misread. "Yes," he said, trying to understand the situation. "Just need to ask you a few things," the officer replied, still trying to match the vague report with what he was seeing. The officer's tone wasn't aggressive. It was procedural, firm, but uncertain. The instructor shifted his folder to his other hand so he could give his full attention. "I work here," he said calmly, expecting that alone would clear things up. But the officer didn't relax. He didn't know him, hadn't attended that day's training, and hadn't been informed that another agency's instructor was scheduled to be on site. From his perspective, the statement lacked verification. "What brings you to this lot?" the officer asked, eyes scanning the instructor's clothing, the badge lanyard partially tucked into his jacket, the plain sedan parked nearby. "I just finished a class. I'm heading out," the instructor said, still patient. Urban noise continued around them. another car door closing, the delivery truck pulling away, a phone notification pinging from somewhere. These ordinary sounds made the exchange feel even more mundane, which is why the tension that slowly formed between them felt subtle rather than dramatic. The officer stepped a little closer. "Do you have identification on you?" The instructor nodded, already reaching to retrieve his credentials. He assumed that once the badge was visible, the situation would dissolve. It always had in the past. But today, the officer's expectations were already shaping how he interpreted each movement. A routine stop was shifting, quietly, slowly, into something more complicated. The instructor held out his credentials, expecting the moment to settle. It usually did. The badge and identification were clear, official, and up to date. But the officer only glanced at them before taking a small step back, as if the information didn't align with whatever he had already assumed. "That doesn't look right," the officer said quietly. The instructor blinked, not offended, just confused. "It's current. I work inside that building. My class ended an hour ago." Instead of examining the credentials more closely, the officer angled them toward the light, searching for something, maybe an imperfection, maybe a detail that justified his concern. The pause stretched longer than it needed to, and the instructor felt a mild discomfort settle in. It wasn't fear, not yet, just the uneasy sense that he wasn't being heard. Two employees leaving the training center slowed their pace when they noticed the interaction. They didn't approach, they simply watched from a distance, unsure whether they were witnessing a routine check or something more serious. Their quiet presence added a layer of pressure, as though the encounter now had an audience the instructor never asked for. The officer handed the credentials back without acknowledging them. "Where did you say you got these?" he asked. "I didn't say," the instructor replied carefully, "but they're issued by the Bureau. I'm an instructor. You can confirm with the front office." The officer didn't move to verify. Instead, he crossed his arms, as if weighing whether the explanation was even plausible. The instructor felt the subtle shift, a moment when disbelief turns into something closer to presumption. He kept his posture open, controlled, doing everything he taught others to do in tense situations. "I've seen a lot of fake badges," the officer murmured. "People print all kinds of things." "I understand," the instructor said, trying to stay patient. "But mine isn't fake. I've been here all day. My car is right there." He pointed, but the officer raised a hand. "Don't reach for anything else." That was the first hint of fear, not sharp or overwhelming, just a quiet tightening in the instructor's chest. He lowered his hand immediately, signaling compliance. He didn't want misunderstanding to grow any further. One of the employees watching from afar shifted uncomfortably. Another muttered something under their breath but didn't intervene. They weren't sure yet what they were seeing. They recognized the instructor, but they weren't close enough to hear the words being exchanged. Their uncertainty mirrored the moment itself. Everyone understood that something felt off, but no one was certain what was wrong. The officer's voice stayed low, but the doubt in it grew more obvious. People impersonate law enforcement to get access to areas they shouldn't. Happens more than you think. The instructor swallowed. "I know, I cover that in training." The irony didn't land. The officer didn't react. Instead, he took another small step toward the instructor, studying his face, as though trying to decide whether it matched the idea of someone who belonged inside a federal training facility. The instructor could feel the embarrassment now, not loud, not public, but internal. A subtle humiliation that came from being dismissed despite doing everything correctly. He wasn't being mocked or threatened, but his legitimacy was being treated as something questionable, something improbable. "Look," the instructor said quietly, "if you call the supervisor on duty, this will be cleared up in a minute." But the officer didn't reach for his radio. He seemed caught between uncertainty and suspicion, leaning toward suspicion simply because it required less correction. For a brief moment, the instructor wondered whether the officer might handcuff him, not because of anything he'd done, but because the misunderstanding had grown roots. The moment passed, but the worry lingered in the air. Then footsteps approached from the direction of the building. Someone else had noticed. The footsteps came from the walkway leading out of the training center. A supervisor, someone who had worked alongside the instructor for years, had stepped outside after hearing the subtle rise in tension. There were no shouts, no dramatic noises, but the hesitation in the voices was enough to draw his attention. He recognized the instructor immediately, even from a distance. "Everything all right here?" the supervisor asked as he approached. The officer straightened, not expecting anyone to intervene. "I'm checking his identification. Something about it doesn't add up." The supervisor looked at the instructor first. "You good?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine," the instructor replied, though the discomfort in his eyes told a more honest story. Then the supervisor turned to the officer. "What exactly seems off?" Before answering, the officer glanced again at the credentials he had already dismissed. "He claims he works here," he said, "but I'm not seeing anything that confirms that." The supervisor blinked once, a slow, controlled gesture. "He doesn't just work here. He runs half the instruction modules on this floor. He's been with us all day." The officer froze, words catching in his throat. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. The two employees who had been watching exchanged glances, sudden recognition replacing confusion. The officer looked between the supervisor and the instructor, trying to reconcile the new information with the assumptions he had been operating under. "Wait, you mean he's actually," the officer began. "Yes," the supervisor said, not unkindly but firmly. "He's an FBI instructor, and a senior one." The officer swallowed hard. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath him. His earlier certainty dissolved into a visible mix of embarrassment and regret. The call said someone was acting suspicious, and the supervisor didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Did you verify his credentials with us before questioning him like this?" The officer hesitated. "I hadn't gotten that far yet." The supervisor nodded slowly, disappointment settling into his expression. "He teaches credential verification. You would have known that if you checked with the front office." The silence that followed was thick, but not dramatic. It was the kind of silence that comes when someone realizes they've made a serious mistake, not out of malice, but out of assumption. "I'm sorry," the officer said, his voice much quieter now. "I didn't know." The instructor accepted the words but didn't immediately respond. He kept his posture steady, the same calm he brought to every training room, though his shoulders carried the weight of the moment. The supervisor stepped closer to the officer. "Look, you're new to this sector. Mistakes happen. But this could have been avoided with one quick call, and you need to recognize how your assumptions influenced what you thought you were seeing." The officer nodded, shame edging into his expression. "I understand." "Do you?" the supervisor asked gently, "because misunderstandings like this don't just inconvenience people, they undermine trust, and in this job, trust matters." The officer looked toward the ground. "I do understand. I should have handled it differently." The supervisor turned back to the instructor. "You shouldn't have had to deal with this on your way out." "It's all right," the instructor said, though the fatigue in his voice made it clear it wasn't truly all right. The officer opened his mouth to offer another apology, but closed it again, unsure whether more words would help or make things worse. The supervisor ended the exchange with quiet finality. "I'll take it from here." And just like that, the tension began to unravel, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with the slow clarity that comes when truth finally enters a space clouded by assumption. In the days that followed, the incident moved from a quiet confrontation in a parking lot to a formal review inside the walls of the training facility. The supervisor filed a report that same evening, documenting the misunderstanding, the officer's refusal to verify credentials, and the unnecessary escalation. It wasn't written with anger or dramatic language, just a factual account of a moment that revealed deeper issues. The local department responded quickly. The officer was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. It wasn't disciplinary at first, it was procedural. But as more details surfaced, especially from the two employees who had witnessed the exchange, the review broadened. The department needed to understand how an experienced officer could dismiss valid federal credentials without even attempting verification. News outlets caught wind of the story within the week. At first, the headlines were straightforward, sticking to the facts. Officer stops federal instructor after mistaken identity. Credentials questioned in parking lot confrontation. But as more context emerged, particularly the part where the officer rejected a legitimate badge, coverage grew sharper. Social media amplified the incident with clips of commentary, opinion threads, and personal stories from people who had experienced similar assumptions in their workplaces or communities. The instructor didn't seek attention, but attention found him anyway. A spokesperson for the Bureau confirmed his position, his years of service, and his role in training officers across multiple states. They emphasized that he had done nothing wrong, and that the misunderstanding highlighted the importance of continued training in bias recognition and identification protocols. The instructor filed a formal complaint, not out of anger, but out of principle. He believed that ignoring the incident would only ensure it happened again to someone else. His complaint outlined the facts and noted the emotional impact, the humiliation of being dismissed, the discomfort of being second-guessed in a place where he had spent years teaching others how to avoid exactly this type of mistake. The local department launched a broader audit of field procedures. They reviewed their standards for verifying identification, particularly when officers encounter personnel from other agencies. They also examined whether training around implicit bias had been adequately implemented. Some findings were uncomfortable but necessary. There were gaps, places where assumptions filled the space left by incomplete practices. Policy changes followed. Officers were required to confirm unfamiliar credentials through dispatch or on-site staff before doubting their validity. Refresher courses on communication and escalation control were expanded. The department also began working more closely with federal instructors, including the very man who had been misidentified, to strengthen cross-agency cooperation. The officer himself faced consequences. After the review concluded, he was suspended for failing to follow standard verification procedure and for allowing personal assumptions to influence his judgment. He later requested additional training, hoping to understand how he had misread the situation so profoundly. His apology, formal and written, was delivered to the instructor through the department's liaison. The instructor read it, appreciated the effort, but still felt the weight of the experience. The words acknowledged responsibility, but they couldn't erase the moment when his legitimacy, something he had earned through years of work, was treated as improbable. In his personal life, the incident left a quieter mark. Friends checked in, colleagues voiced support, but he found himself replaying the moment, wondering how a simple walk to his car had turned into evidence that even within professional spaces, assumptions could override truth in an instant. Nothing about the aftermath was explosive, yet its impact was steady, persistent, and undeniably real. The incident became another reminder that progress doesn't come from ignoring discomfort, it comes from examining it carefully, then deciding what must change. When stepping back from the details of the incident, what emerges is not a story about a single officer or a single mistake. It becomes a reflection of how assumptions operate quietly within everyday systems. Bias, in this context, doesn't appear as open hostility or deliberate wrongdoing. It appears in the small gaps between perception and reality, moments when someone fills those gaps with what they expect instead of what is actually there. The officer didn't set out that day intending to target the wrong person. He was responding to a vague call, interpreting incomplete information, and trying to make sense of a scene he didn't fully understand. But intention isn't what determines impact. The outcome was shaped by the assumptions he carried with him, many of which he may not have even recognized. Those assumptions influenced how he saw the instructor, how he interpreted his gestures, and how quickly he dismissed clear identification. The narrator's lens shows how easy it is for small judgments to grow roots. A gesture misread, a face unfamiliar, a role that doesn't match what someone imagines. These factors quietly guide decisions, even when someone believes they are acting objectively. In policing, the consequences of these assumptions are magnified, not because every situation becomes dangerous, but because authority gives them weight. The instructor's experience demonstrates how frustrating and discouraging it can be to have one's legitimacy questioned without basis. This wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a violent encounter. It was an everyday moment in which a person's identity, professionalism, and earned authority were treated as unlikely. The emotional weight didn't come from loud conflict. It came from being dismissed in a space he had devoted his career to improving. Incidents like this remind us that systems don't change simply by adding more rules. They improve when people inside them recognize how subtle patterns shape outcomes. A verification policy is only useful if officers apply it consistently. Bias training only matters if individuals acknowledge that assumptions, no matter how small, can influence their reactions. Cross-agency cooperation only works when professionals believe one another's credentials are worth the benefit of the doubt. The broader lesson is not that officers are inherently prone to misjudgment, nor that misunderstandings are inevitable. It is that awareness must be constant. Professionals must question their own expectations as readily as they question others. They must learn to pause in moments when instinct pushes them forward too quickly. That pause can prevent confusion, embarrassment, and the erosion of trust. For viewers and readers, the takeaway is equally important. Bias doesn't always shout. It often whispers. It appears in ordinary interactions, in offices, in parking lots, in shared workspaces. It appears when someone assumes a person doesn't belong, or that their role is less than what it is, or that their explanation is less credible than others. These assumptions may feel small individually, but collectively, they create environments where people must constantly prove themselves, even when they have already earned their place. The narrator's reflection closes with a simple truth. fairness requires intention. Systems don't drift toward equity on their own. People must guide them through awareness, accountability, and the willingness to examine even the most uncomfortable moments. What happened in that parking lot is not unique, but it is instructive. It shows how easily a routine situation can become a reminder that identity and authority are not always judged equally. And it urges all of us, especially those in positions of responsibility, to slow down, listen fully, and recognize that assumptions, even quiet ones, carry real consequences. Stories like this one often leave people with mixed feelings: frustration, recognition, disbelief, or quiet understanding. Many viewers see parts of their own experiences reflected in moments like the one that unfolded in that parking lot. Others may recognize situations they've witnessed at work, in public spaces, or even within their own families. These aren't distant, dramatic events. They're everyday interactions that reveal how easily assumptions can shape someone's reality. So we want to hear from you. Have you ever been misjudged because of how you looked, where you were, or what someone assumed about your role? Have you seen a coworker or friend go through something similar? Moments like these don't have to involve law enforcement to be meaningful. They show up in job interviews, in stores, in airports, in classrooms, and in simple interactions that could have gone differently with just a little more awareness. Your perspectives matter because they build a fuller picture of how these issues appear in daily life. When people share their stories, others begin to understand the patterns, not just through statistics or formal reports, but through personal experiences that give context to the challenges many face quietly. We also invite those who work in law enforcement, security, or public service to share their insights. What are the pressures that shape split-second decisions? What training or policies do you believe make a real difference? Where do you feel systems fall short? And what changes would you want to see implemented? Honest dialogue helps bridge gaps that often feel wider than they really are. If you've watched this far, it means the story resonated with you in some way. Maybe you were surprised by how subtle the misunderstanding was. Maybe you recognized the emotional weight of being doubted in a place where you should feel secure. Or maybe you're thinking about how easily this could happen in your own workplace. That's why these conversations matter. Change doesn't happen only in classrooms or policy meetings. It happens when people start questioning the small assumptions they carry with them. It happens when individuals decide to speak up, or to listen more closely, or to consider perspectives they hadn't noticed before. It happens when communities, online and offline, come together to reflect on what fairness and responsibility should look like in real, everyday situations. If you've experienced something similar, tell us how it unfolded. How did you respond? What did you take away from it? And if you haven't experienced it directly, what stood out to you in this story? What do you think could help prevent incidents like this in the future? Your comments not only support the conversation, they help guide the direction of future investigations and stories we share. Our goal is to highlight real moments that reveal deeper truths about how systems work, how people perceive one another, and how small actions can make a big difference. If you found this documentary helpful, informative, or thought-provoking, consider subscribing or following our channel. We explore real stories that uncover the human experiences behind everyday conflicts and misunderstandings. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people who might see their own lives reflected in them. Thank you for watching, for thinking deeply, and for being part of a community that believes awareness leads to change. We look forward to hearing your voice in the comments below.